The story of chimpanzee nature has been commonly used as an allegory for the construction of stories about our own nature. Chimp Empire brings us a high-quality, engrossing new iteration of this allegory. Mahershala Ali's hypnotic voice tells us,
chimpanzees are our closest living relatives. We can often recognize the best and worst of ourselves in them. Chimp society is a hierarchy. Each chimp always looking for opportunities to move up. If you want power, you must take it.
This rhetoric primes us to conceive of our own social hierarchies as developing out of a natural proclivity for hierarchy, as evidenced by our closest living relatives. There is one problem with this line of reasoning though, that the drive for domination in human nature can be explained by looking at how a 98% human society behaves in the wild. That problem is a spectre, haunting the justifications of those promoting this appeal to nature, the spectre of the bonobo. We're told often chimps are our closest living relatives. Chimp Empire is not the only offender of this half-truth, but too often the existence of the bonobo is omitted from discussions of human nature. We also share 98% of our DNA with bonobos. At this stage, there really seems to be no consensus on which one we are that slight bit more closely related to. The margins are very fine, but something important to remember is they are more closely related to each other than to us, sharing 99.6% of each other's DNA. Despite being composed of such alignment and genetic makeup, they display wildly different behavior. Chimps have rigid hierarchy, patriarchy. They do not form social relations with groups outside of their tribe and go to war with neighboring tribes over territory. Bonobos, on the other hand, are far more egalitarian. They have a matriarchal society where strong female bonds maintain a stable alliance of female leadership. They are far less aggressive, they fraternize with other tribes, and their associations are far more flexible, with individual bonobos sifting between groups casually. There has never, literally never, been a recorded case of a bonobo killing another bonobo in the wild or in captivity. It's kind of mind-blowing. It's like when you find out, despite all the fear-mongering and propaganda, no one has ever OD'd from cannabis.
These high school boys and girls are having a hop at the local soda fountain. Innocently they dance. Innocent of a new and deadly menace lurking behind closed doors. Marijuana, the burning weed with its roots in hell.
Despite all the storytelling around human nature as reflected in the hierarchy and brutality of our closest living relative, the chimpanzee, the spectre of the bonobo haunts this story, and if we were to fully acknowledge their existence, at the very least this should negate the appeals to nature that emanate from the interests of those who benefit from an understanding of our society as naturally hierarchical and dominating. Of course, it should go without saying, absolutely zero shade intended towards chimpanzees. Chimps are fucking awesome creatures. The show does do some work to complicate the essentialized understanding of chimps as exclusively aggressive, demonstrating their capacity for compassionate behavior. I'm personally pro any show that, for lack of a better word, humanizes any animal species and encourages human solidarity for the preservation of non-human life. However, while the show does present nuance in chimpanzee behavior, and is careful to include the notion that as well as being similar to us, chimps are also different in plenty of ways. On balance though, the story does lean into these socially constructed predispositions of society as naturally hierarchical, that is often reflected in our products of cultural production.
You have proven you can rule yourself, now you must learn to rule others.
This critique of the show is in no way motivated by a desire to cancel Chimp Empire or to persuade you not to watch it. Chimps are beautiful, the show is beautiful, it's absolutely worth your time, but much in the same way trans employees at Netflix in the wake of Dave Chappelle's last special demanded not that Netflix remove the special, but that if they were willing to spend $20 million every time he wanted to stand up and talk ignorant trash about trans people for an hour, then there needs to be some balance in programming, and we should see a significant allocation of funds for shows that emphasize the transgender perspective. This is a request for increased cultural production that presents us with the bonobo perspective. Because seriously, bonobo erasure is a real thing, and I think that says very interesting things about our society and culture industry, that we are shown many stories that feature great ape representation, and especially when it comes to allegories of human nature, it's most commonly the chimpanzee that stands in for us, but so rarely do we see bonobos, our equal closest living relative, and the only member of the ape family that is organized along matriarchal egalitarian egalitarian lines with minimal aggression in their society. There are a number of representations of chimps, gorillas, orangutans, and I bet if asked, most of us could name at least one of each of these apes from a children's cartoon or something. But can you name a bonobo represented in popular fiction? There is Bonobo the recording artist, which is a sign they exist to some extent in the public consciousness, but have any of us seen an actual representation of a bonobo? They are so sparsely represented that when you look at the Wikipedia page for categories of fictional apes, they are the only species not listed. Well, after extensive research scouring the depths of popular culture, there seems to be only one bonobo amongst the mix. So if you've seen The Rise of the Planet of the Apes and sequel Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, which let's be honest, we all have because they're fucking awesome, then you'll have met Koba, a bonobo who's had a life of mistreatment in animal testing facilities, and upon receiving the drug that increases ape intelligence to such an extent that they could launch a revolution, Koba is now able to exact revenge on those who subjected him to a lifetime of mistreatment. You'd be forgiven for not realizing Koba is a bonobo. I totally thought he was just another chimpanzee. It's never explicitly stated in the films. They just kind of rely on their audience having an advanced understanding of primatology to be able to distinguish Koba as different from the other chimps. But he is a bonobo, the only representation of a bonobo we have in popular media. So what can we learn from this lone bonobo influencer? Well, despite bonobos being the most peaceful, cooperative, non-hierarchical of the ape family, Koba is the villain, who after instigating a false flag attack, launches a coup against leader Caesar, and leads the apes into a violent confrontation with the humans. His reign also ushers in a harsher, more brutal system of hierarchy. Some have interpreted this to mean that given Koba is a bonobo, an ape imbued with a more peaceful nature, that this represents a story of how even when the best among us are subjected to abuse, we can be corrupted and brought down to the level of the abuser, Harvey Dent style.
The Joker chose me because you were the best of us. He wanted to prove that even someone as good as you could fall.
I think it's fair to suggest this could be the intention of the writers of the Rise franchise, given this is an extremely common character motivation in Hollywood blockbusters. Start out good, get mistreated, turn bad, and the balanced, pragmatic anti-hero will take you down and restore the status quo. And to be honest, I don't buy this as the most salient interpretation. I could let it slide maybe if bonobos were no less represented in our media than other apes, but this is the only notable one we have, and he's a sadistic dictator. It's an interesting choice. The name Koba was used in a 19th century Georgian novel. And who should happen to be a fanboy of this particular 19th century novel but the late great Joseph Stalin? Stalin even used the name Koba as a pseudonym. So okay, now we're getting somewhere. Koba is clearly an instantiation of Stalin. He comes to power and immediately he locks up political prisoners loyal to the old regime and puts humans in gulags, because he is a bonobo, an ape who organizes along egalitarian lines with more flexible hierarchies and even distribution of resources. That's communism!
Please come with me to Rainbow Land, where unicorns are made of fudge and cotton candy, and everything is free. It's a fictitious place. Rainbow Land is fiction. I think anybody that writes about the redistribution of wealth sounds like a communist to me.
It would be too on the nose to just name him Stalin. They've got to sneak it in there, but make no mistake, it's definitely Stalin they're going for.
Joe Stalin. You know, that's pretty good. You might want to try Joseph.
Given my hypothesis that the explanation for bonobo erasure is a result of cultural hegemony, whereby culture is controlled by and reflects the interests of a ruling group who benefit from representations of human nature as a system of naturally arising hierarchies and drives for domination, as this legitimizes their position atop these hierarchies and lays the blame for inequalities at the feet of an unchangeable human nature.
Everything you create is used to destroy.
We call it human nature.
It then makes sense that the one and only representation of the bonobo, an ape whose existence contradicts these narratives and is very inconvenient for the seamless proliferation of these narratives, it makes sense that the one chance we might have to see an alternative representation of human nature as something other than rigid hierarchical domination, that the vessel for this possibility just so happens to be the most morally corrupt of us all, and reminds us that desiring a better, fairer world will inevitably lead to a Stalinist dictatorship. The actions of Koba, aka Stalin, also help the protagonist Caesar to understand his desire for apes to be better than humans was misguided. Apes are just as violent and morally imperfect as people are. It is quite ironic because the main way it's communicated in the story that Caesar wants apes to achieve a standard that humans couldn't is that apes shouldn't kill other apes. What was the one and only ape that's never killed a member of its own species before? Oh yeah, the freaking bonobo. By the film's own standards, actually existing bonobos are better than the human nature Caesar was trying to escape the rest of apekind from replicating. We spent some time on the relevance of Koba's name as invoking a certain historical dictator. So what of the protagonist's name, Caesar? Some word association with the name would likely bring you to a word like empire, given the wider understanding of Julius Caesar as the most prominent historical figure associated with the rise of the Roman Empire. So then would you say Caesar, as chimp, gives rise to a chimp empire? The connection of the concepts of empire with chimpanzees is clearly priming us to understand their existence as conforming to the same human structures of elite hierarchical dominance, and conversely naturalizes our understanding of human history along the same lines. We're repeatedly reminded of how like them we are,
Our closest living relatives.
with no mention of the bonobos, and how their world is competitive, hierarchical, dominating, and violent.
Chimp society is a hierarchy.
So the story we hear of our own nature as being this way finds explanation with an appeal to nature. Chimps, our closest living relatives, behave this way, so if we behave this way as well, this must be natural and inescapable. But of course, this is just one side of the story. The only side we hear on a regular basis, with the bonobo equivalent being excluded from modern culture and contemporary popular understandings of human history. Take for example the book Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Noah Harari. This was an extremely popular book. As of May 2022, it had spent 182 weeks on the New York Times bestseller lists, with 96 consecutive weeks. In her critique of the book in Current Affairs magazine, Dashana Narayanan notes the guru-like status that Yuval Harari has acquired as a result of this book, being seen as a wise sage by leaders of the current capitalist world order. Mark Zuckerberg sits down with him to discuss the issues of our age, head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, does the same thing, and Barack Obama is clearly a fan too.
The other book that I really enjoyed, a book by an Israeli author, Yuval Harari, called Sapiens. It's a sweeping history of the human race. It talks about some core things that have allowed us to build this extraordinary civilization.
Why was this book so popular, especially amongst the liberal ruling class? Because what this book is a story that perpetuates the same myths that can be found lingering in shows like Chimp Empire and films like the Rise of the Planet of the Apes franchise. A story that tells us the way things are isn't actually so bad. The hierarchies and domination have actually played a necessary role in the creation of the world we have now, and we shouldn't be so critical of them, and we should appreciate the world that we've built. In an interview with The New Yorker, Harari was quoted as saying of the popularity of Sapiens, "There is absolutely nothing there that is new. I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not a primatologist. I mean, I did zero new research. It was really reading the kind of common knowledge and just presenting it in a new way." These are old stories that have been repackaged with a slick pseudo-intellectual branding that justifies the predominance of the status quo view of human nature.
Does man, that marvel of the universe, that glorious paradox who sent me to the stars, still make war against his brother, keep his neighbor's children starving?
Then let's look at a book like The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity by David Graeber and David Wengrow. This book received very positive reviews, it won awards, it did make it onto the New York Times bestseller list, but had nowhere near the endurance that Sapiens had, nowhere near the level of penetration into the public discourse, and you would absolutely not ever hear the book's title uttered from the mouths of people like Barack Obama and Mark Zuckerberg. There is a very notable absence of admiration from the liberal establishment. This is because The Dawn of Everything presents an alternative story of human history to the one told by Harari in Sapiens, one that does not justify a ruling class and dominating structures of hierarchy as naturally occurring and inevitable. They in fact set their sights on liberal storytellers that have perpetuated these myths with one-sided exclusionary narratives that legitimize this version of human nature, authors such as Francis Fukuyama, Steven Pinker, and Yuval Noah Harari. The Dawn of Everything, though, is not a mirror image of this one-sided story of human nature that depicts true human nature as perfectly loving, morally pure, or inclined towards anarchical organization as opposed to hierarchy. What the book tries to do is to complicate this very simple story we've been told, and to say human nature is not one thing or inclined in one particular direction. The capacities for human behavior and organization are vast, multivariate, and contingent on historical conditions. The bonobo is the example in nature we can point to that best represents these ignored capacities in a species just as closely related to us as the chimpanzee. If we could start to see stories being told that complicate our understandings of human nature as inescapably dark and dominating, the bonobo would be an appropriate vessel for countering the position of the chimpanzee as evidence of our own brutality in the present cultural hegemony.
Like, chimps recognize you need your fingers in order to do things. You need your face in order to see. You need your dick in order to fuck. So that's the things they go after.
Fucking assholes.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
One particular aspect of the Bonobo worthy of emphasizing is their matriarchal power structure, something all too refreshing in our world of red-pilled manosphere alpha bros.
If the feminist imperative is correct, and that this whole patriarchy idea isn't something that's evolutionary and natural, and it's something that we've instilled, how come it happened in every single society across the earth since the dawn of human time?
Yeah. While Chimp Empire does note an alpha male is not always a single ruthless despot, with one chimp group having a more dispersed power structure, though still only amongst a clique of high-ranking males. Of course, if you're going to make a documentary about chimp society, including the patriarchal power structure would be a part of that, but it is rather unfortunate positioning that we get introduced to the alpha male right after we've been shown the introductory monologue that positions us as so similar to chimps and their world of competitive hierarchy.
At the top of the hierarchy sits the most powerful chimp in Ngogo, Jackson, the alpha male.
Upon hearing this in this context of chimps as an allegory for human society, we are now prompted to think, oh yeah, alpha males. They exist in nature. Humans come from nature. Patriarchy is natural.
Every single society in history ever, men were in charge.
Yeah, it's a very natural thing.
It's the way it's supposed to be.
It's common sense,
The
in my opinion.
math doesn't add up any other way.
Yeah.
So it's like men have evolved to lead. Men should be in charge. This is how it is.
The term alpha male was coined by primatologist Franz de Waal, who also happens to be one of the leading experts on bonobo behavior. He now disavows the term alpha male as it has led to unfortunate confusion in the field and wider society that views positions of leadership as necessitating male domination.
But to apply the term as the people do today, people usually with an alpha male they mean a bully. Someone who beats you over the head and lets you know every day that he's the boss. I'm partly responsible for that because I wrote this book, Chimpanzee Politics, and used the term alpha male quite frequently. And then the Republicans in Washington, they picked up on the book. It reached also the business community, who started producing books of how to become the alpha male of the company and let everyone know that you're boss.
But de Waal says this is not strictly the case. Some males in certain species are considered the leader for demonstrating the greatest capacity for compassion amongst the group. Obviously, in the case of bonobos, there is no alpha male, and the female matriarchs do not rule with cold, brutal domination. It is interesting that not only are bonobos generally ignored from popular fiction and discourses on human nature, but so too are discussions of matriarchy. In the Rise franchise, the ape world is explicitly patriarchal. Sure, this makes some sense as chimps, gorillas, and orangutans have patriarchal societies, and the one featured bonobo happens to be a sadistic psychopath, so yeah, patriarchy's probably gonna predominate there. But much like bonobos are ignored in these movies, women are also seldom represented in the story. We have Caesar's wife Cornelia, who basically just exists to have Caesar's sons. Every other significant ape is male. In both Rise and Dawn, we have one female human character, who kinda just exists as the companion to the central male human character, and not providing a great deal to the story. The fact that the Bechdel test exists and identifies a real observable phenomenon that once you're made aware of you can't unsee. For a movie to pass the Bechdel test, an on-screen conversation between two female characters is required, where the subject of conversation is something other than a male character. Once you know this information, it becomes a lens you can't not look through, and the Rise movies absolutely fail this test, along with many, many other movies. The fact that it's such a frequent and noticeable occurrence points to a pattern of male overrepresentation in media, and along with this comes the trappings of patriarchal and hierarchical understandings of human nature that legitimize the role of men as ruler and women as ruled. This state of affairs, though, is not obvious to a casual observer. When you're told chimps are our closest living relatives, you don't say, hey, what about the bonobos? Because you haven't even been told the bonobo exists. I think there's more awareness of the female perspective being ignored in media than there was a decade ago when the Rise films were made, but it still wouldn't be something you questioned unless you were told to look for it. Feminist writer Bell Hooks talks of the hidden nature of patriarchal society. This rule of silence is upheld when the culture refuses everyone easy access even to the word patriarchy. Most children do not learn what to call this system of institutionalized gender roles, so rarely do we name it in everyday speech. This silence promotes denial, and how can we organize to challenge and change a system that cannot be named? It's notable that while Chimp Empire points to a male-dominated chimp society, the word patriarchy is not used to describe this. One movie this year, though, made repeated references to patriarchy, probably more than any other Hollywood movie to date, and all of us men took it really well.
Man-hating. Elon Musk complains, if you take a shot every time Barbie says the word patriarchy, you will pass out before the movie ends.
114 minutes of spiteful, bitter, mean-spirited, borderline unhinged hatred of men.
Third wave, intersectional, subversive, man-hating, power-hungry, destructive feminism. I hated this film.
Good job, boys. I'm proud of us. You can see the reaction that gets triggered when media identifies a system of power that can usually rely on the culture industry to ignore its role in our society. If patriarchy can slip by unnoticed, it just becomes an unquestioned arrangement in the logic of our social ideology. It desires to be hidden so that it cannot be confronted. If popular stories can shine light on unjust systems of power, we as a society can more easily understand and combat them. Of course, Barbie had its fair share of criticism from feminist quarters as well, and there were legitimate criticisms to be made of a movie produced by a major corporation arguably profiting from patriarchal dynamics of unrealistic societal beauty standards, using the movie to brand itself as an icon of female empowerment. #woke capitalism. But at the end of the day, this was a major box office success that actually named the system of patriarchy in a direct manner, and deployed it as a central theme and plot driver, something that can't be said for really any other blockbuster of this kind. So, on that basis, I feel it exceeds expectations, while obviously having very strict limits in how far it would push it. A way I feel the film could have gone further was in the vision it pushed of a matriarchal utopia, which was somewhat stunted in imagination of how differently a female society could be organized. For instance, all the institutions of patriarchal society are replicated in Barbieland. We have a Supreme Court filled with women, and corporations are run by female CEOs. But the Supreme Court is an inherently patriarchal institution. It's composed of judges appointed by whoever is president to represent a political agenda, not by popular election, and they are lifetime appointments. There is no accountability. You cannot lose the job, no matter how hard Clarence Thomas tries to push that theory to its limits. You have 9 people from elite backgrounds, essentially ordained with the power to decide what is or isn't law, and it's always been a body that upholds private property as the tantamount right. But the problem isn't that the right people aren't on the court, it's that the court itself is an institution of hierarchy and rules in favor of a dominant hierarchical status quo. The same with corporations. With women as CEO, they're still beholden to the capitalist incentives of profit and accumulation that inevitably lead to worker exploitation and imperialism. The corporate structure is a rigid system of hierarchy. When humans are put in these positions, they will replicate the ideology of the hierarchical institution they inhabit, thus replicating the system of patriarchy. Bell Hooks, in conversation with Gloria Steinem, speaks on the disaggregation of gender and patriarchy.
One of my constant themes is patriarchy has no gender. And I think that we have to remember that people's allegiance to patriarchy isn't static. That people can start off in feminism and unfortunately end up in patriarchy.
What she's getting at is that in reducing the idea of patriarchy to rule by men, we sort of forget to understand how it is that these men are ruling, how they are using power. Then we might think the solution is just to plug women into these positions, but we've forgotten these positions exist in a context of severe hierarchical domination. The conception of matriarchy as rule by women, anthropologist Peggy Sanday argues, is a conception born of Western patriarchy. The time is long overdue for challenging the Western definition of matriarchy as rule by women. This definition has had the unfortunate consequence of producing over a century of squabbling over a vision that could only have been crafted through a Western patriarchal lens. From the time of the first delineation of the Western definition of matriarchy in the 19th century, its meaning was fashioned by analogy with patriarchy, not by reference to ethnographic studies of female-oriented social forms. Peggy Sanday spent time living with the Minangkabau, the world's largest matriarchal society of 4 million people in Indonesia. In her 1981 book, Women at the Center, Life in a Modern Matriarchy, she tells us Western thought, conceiving of matriarchy as rule by women, came to the conclusion that matriarchies didn't exist, as there were no societies where women ruled. Or at least Western observers could not recognize how societies such as the Minangkabau expressed matriarchal power structures, because when they examined them, they didn't find a political system dominated by women as men dominate it under patriarchy. In Maninkabau society, the relationship between the sexes Sande described as being on an equal footing, egalitarian, or linked rather than ranked, in a partnership rather than a dominator relationship. Matriarchal societies are not mirror images of patriarchal ones. The women do not dominate in positions of power. Power is more diffuse, there is strong social accountability when it comes to enforcing power, and power is not seen as purely a mechanism of top-down coercion but of communal interest. Feminist Nancy Hartsock, writing of women's liberation discourse in the 70s, noted the centrality of conceptions of power to those discussions. Most social scientists have based their discussions of power on definitions of power as the ability to compel obedience, or as control and domination. Power must be power over someone. However, there are other definitions of power. Power, she points out, was defined by Webster's dictionary as the ability to act, the faculty of doing or performing something. The words control and domination do not appear as synonyms. In our patriarchal system, the concept of power is devised as the power you have over someone to control and coerce them into fulfilling your needs. A matriarchal society would not be looking to simply maintain this power over someone definition while flipping the balance between genders. It is looking to redefine power in our institutions as power to provide for communal needs. In The Dawn of Everything, they look at the Wendat First Nations people of Canada and their interactions with French colonists in the 18th century. Wendat intellectual Candiaronk observed of French society, the whole apparatus of trying to force people to behave well would be unnecessary if France did not also maintain a contrary apparatus that encourages people to behave badly. That apparatus consisted of money, property rights, and the resultant pursuit of material self-interest. This recognition of money as a mechanism of coercive power over one another is a key observation replicated in Marxist analysis. Marx writes, "Money's properties are my properties and essential powers. Thus, what I am and am capable of is by no means determined by my individuality. I am stupid, but money is the real mind of all things, and how then should its possessor be stupid? Besides, he can buy talented people for himself, and is he who has power over the talented not more talented than the talented?" Others who defend the status quo liberal society tell a very different story of the role of money in hierarchy to the one I'm telling here.
So we can build these huge networks of cooperation, and everything we've accomplished as a species, it's based on that. Then you ask, okay, so what makes it possible for millions of people who don't know each other to cooperate in a way that Neanderthals or chimpanzees couldn't? At least my answer is stories, is fiction. It's the imagination. But it's the same thing with modern politics. It's the same thing with economics. People think, oh, economics, this is rational. It has nothing to do with fictional stories. No. Money is the most successful story ever told. The bankers, the finance ministers, all these people, they are the best storytellers ever. And they tell us a story that this green little piece of paper or this bit of information, it is worth a banana. And as long as everybody believes it, it works.
I am 100% in agreement with Harari that everything is stories, and how those stories create shared bonds between people. But the story he tells of the bankers being in charge of the story, which that part is true, they do control the story, but how in being responsible for telling us the story of money, they have led us to a world of cooperation on a scale never before seen. That's just not a story I believe in. An alternate storyteller might say the banker's fairy tale has led to a world of coercion on a scale never before seen, where billions of people are forced to perform labor that ultimately benefits the bankers as the dominators of this hierarchical system. And the thing is, I'm not even asking you to believe this story over Harari's story. I would just like it if this story would have the opportunity to be told more widely, so that we may get a broader view of the possibilities for alternative social arrangements. But those in our societies whose responsibility it is to disseminate stories in our culture, Hollywood, Netflix, public intellectuals, are stenographers for the wishes of finance capital and its patriarchal constitution. They tell us the same story, again and again and again, that humanity has always sought to arrange itself according to a logic of domination, hierarchy, and exploitation. This reality is inescapable and determined by the laws of nature, and we should just look on the bright side and make the best of it, excluding the spectres that contradict these narratives, like our history of matriarchal societies and our other closest living relatives, the bonobos. Not to say that matriarchy and bonobo society are the true reflections of human nature, nature, but they represent another side of the spectrum we are all too ignorant of, due to our shared stories being entirely the construction of a dominating hierarchy that wishes to legitimize its position of power over us. I'd like to just finish up by returning to the conversation between Gloria Steinem and Bell Hooks, where Steinem remarks on the history of matriarchal societies that have been wiped out.
This time of patriarchy, monotheism, racism, nationalism is relatively new. I mean, think about the 500 or 600 nations that were here in the first place. You know, they were matrilineal, not matriarchal, not like women, but mostly they seem to have been matrilineal. We're just rediscovering this because it was cut off from us for both political reasons and reasons of guilt, because we killed 90% of them. Everything we want once was here. And that somehow gives me faith that it's not human nature. You know, that their paradigm was the circle, not the pyramid, not the hierarchy.
It's not that human nature is dominating, it's that the dominating societies wiped out matriarchal egalitarian ones. But as they've been wiped out, they've been forgotten, because storytellers such as Yuval Harari do not represent them in their stories, because Netflix will only tell stories about the brutal hierarchies of nature, not the peaceful cooperatives, because Hollywood will depict desires for a better world as the most corrupting and depraved of impulses. And we must realize we are eternally damned to fulfill the prophecy of naturally ordained hierarchical domination. When Nancy Hartsock was writing of the need for alternative conceptions of power in the 70s, there was a thriving feminist sci-fi scene that depicted alternative utopian societies that experimented with different social arrangements, broke down gender roles, and explored how technologies could liberate us from a life of alienated labor that benefits a patriarchal ruling class. A lack of such imagination in the popular consciousness today is a real loss when we consider we live in the era of patriarchal tech capitalism, driven by a desire to use technology to drive us further into atomization, where we are more and more powerless to confront the structures of domination we are subjected to. Or, you know, to hear them describe it.
But there will also be opportunities and benefits that we can't even imagine yet. For connection, for creation, for learning, and joy. Joy, joy, joy.
When you hear that statistic from Oxfam that the poorest half of the world's population own about as much as the 85 richest people in the world, including you, of course, does that make you feel uncomfortable?
Well, what makes me uncomfortable is that children die, that people don't get a good education, they don't get enough nutrition, and that's what I've devoted my life to working on. And so all of that money that's in my hands is actually going against those problems.
But you don't deny the gap between rich and poor seems to have got worse.
No, the gap between rich and poor has not gotten worse, thank goodness.
I want to thank every Amazon employee and every Amazon customer, because you guys paid for all of this.
I disagree with the idea of unions, but perhaps for a reason that is different than people may expect, which is I just don't like anything which creates kind of a lords and peasants sort of thing. And I think the unions naturally try to create negativity in a company.
Money, money, money.
The thing that's so admirable about Ayn Rand is the individual against the collective. The individual is right.
Stories are how we make sense of the world, and without stories to combat the primacy of hierarchy and domination in human nature, then we will never be able to recreate a world where this is not the popular consensus on reality.
Like, chimps recognize you need your fingers in order to do things. You need your face in order to see. You need your dick in order to fuck. So that's the things they go after.
In every single society in history ever, men were in charge.
Yeah, it's a very natural thing.
Bankers, the finance ministers, they are the best storytellers ever.
Innocent of a new and deadly menace lurking behind closed doors.
The individual against the collective. The individual is right.
Power-hungry, destructive feminism.
And joy?
Sounds like a communist to me!
The poorest half of the world's population own about as much as the 85 richest people in the world, including you, of course. Does that make you feel uncomfortable?
Well, what makes me uncomfortable is